Good morning to everybody, and we've gone live now. So we'll say hello and welcome to those that are watching remotely. Might be a few more today. We have quite a few people out sick, and we would like to wish them better health and pray that they're going to have a swift recovery. So we're going to be talking today about this book in particular. I'm not going to talk about the whole book, but I did want to introduce some concepts that we'll be talking about later today from this book, Miracles, written by C.S. Lewis. And the more that I read the writings of C.S. Lewis, the more convinced I am that he and I would have gotten along really well. He probably wouldn't have wanted to talk to me, but I certainly would have wanted to hang out with him. The guy's absolutely a brilliant thinker. I did not realize how brilliant. My knowledge early on was limited to the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, right? Which is rudimentary compared to his philosophical writings. All the things that he has written about religion are tremendously useful, and I think we still see, much like we see the impact of Tolkien throughout our culture, I think even to perhaps a deeper degree, I think we see the thinking of C.S. Lewis. So I'm very impressed, and again, the things that I'm talking about today, I was going to talk about of my own volition. I had come to some of these conclusions myself, although again, I say that there's no telling where some of this influence might have come from in my thinking. So maybe there's a little bit of what I had thought that I had gotten from some source that had gotten it from Lewis. But certainly the things that he talks about in chapter 3 of this book are very, very cogent, very relevant to our other study later on today. So what is this book, Miracles? And this is kind of what Philip has been talking about as well, quite a bit lately. So this book, Miracles, he talks about miracles, and basically the chapters that are there are these. Let me give you a brief overview here. He talks about miracles and why people that believe in naturalism wouldn't believe in miracles. He talks about how the universe can't be explained just through the mechanical movement of atoms. And there's some key points that I'd like to bring out, specifically in chapter 3. But let me tell you, I'll start with the first chapter. He talks about the scope of the book. He says, miracles can't be proven or disproven solely by experience. Our worldview influences how we interpret events. I would say that I agree with that, because people come to the table with preconceived notions, and so they would tend to explain away miracles. There are plenty of people that say, oh, well, I know that the Bible says that this miracle happened, that miracle happened, but I don't believe them because miracles never happen. I've never seen a miracle. Miracles cannot exist in the world that I understand in my brain, and so therefore there must be some other explanation. He says, historical evidence is insufficient to prove miracles unless we first determine whether miracles are possible. So that's an interesting point, and that's kind of the thrust of the rest of the book, is showing that the physicality of the universe is not sufficient to explain miracles, obviously, but can we say that the universe only exists as atoms and there's nothing beyond the physical world? So that's kind of the point of the book, is to establish that there is more to the world, to the universe, than just the material part of it. So again, chapter 1 is kind of an intro. Chapter 2, he talks about these two worldviews, naturalism, versus supernaturalism. So you have basically, I don't know that you could view it in any other way. I mean, I don't know that there's any other way to carve up the your view of things. Either only nature exists, only the physical world, or supernaturalism, which of course we acknowledge nature, but we say that there is something more to nature. Let me see if I can scroll down a bit. This is just kind of an overview visual. It's not going to let me use it. Hey, I can click. I just can't move. Can I use my... Hey. There we go. All right, so I'm trying to move my display over here. So again, you see on the chart that I've made, the slide here, there are two worldviews, naturalism versus supernaturalism. And then he talks about what is the naturalist view of reality. So naturalism is the belief that the universe is a self-contained system of cause and effect with absolutely no external interference. Whereas the supernaturalist view of reality, nature is a created system created by God. So we believe that there is a being that transcends nature who created nature and can intervene in nature. Naturalism views all phenomena, including thought, and this is really going to be the crux of a lot of our discussion today. Naturalism views all phenomena, including thought itself, as products of the natural system. Supernaturalism sees reason and thought as evidence of something beyond nature. So that becomes the key question. Is the idea that we can think, that we can reason, are these things which come from, not that they're rooted in nature, not that there are natural laws that govern it, but that the actual act of thinking comes from this evolution of the physical world, and we are just the pinnacle of this mechanical evolution that gives us the ability to think and to reason. And he points out that these two views are ultimately incompatible. You have to choose between them. They both can't exist. And of course, the idea, does naturalism undermine reason? Reason depends on logical connections, not physical causes. Let's see, I'm going to skip down just a bit. Materialism refutes itself by invalidating reasoning. We'll talk some more about that. I'm sorry, I've had a hard time reading it. Hopefully y'all can read it. Maybe you can read it at home. Hopefully the home viewers can read this. He talks about the problem of naturalism. We get into that more in chapter 3. The main idea here in chapter 3 is that naturalism undermines its own validity by failing to account for the reliability of human reason. Naturalism asserts that all events, including thoughts, arise from non-rational causes, that is, cause-effect relationships. Reason depends on a ground-consequence relationship, as he calls it, this ground consequence, where conclusions are based on logical connections, not mere causes. And he says if human reasoning is purely the result of irrational processes, it cannot reliably lead to the truth. Therefore, naturalism refutes itself because it depends on reasoning to establish its claims. It's kind of the bootstrap. It's just not possible, and that's what naturalism aims to say, is that thinking is the process of it comes from this natural process, this evolutionary process, where these more complex systems somehow have arisen through this survival of the fittest mechanism to lead to us ultimately, this ability to reason and even consciousness itself, which again, is I've never heard any convincing argument that would say how we can think and reason, and how that came through the natural processes of evolution, as they say. Supernaturalism, by contrast, allows for the existence of a rational God who is the source of human reason. So again, this is these slides up here. I'm just going to leave them up as just kind of a reference. Whoops. Okay, so here are the main topics again. Naturalism versus supernaturalism. That is, again, the thrust of what we are talking about today. All right, I'm going to leave it right there so we can kind of remember the main points of what we're talking about. Hey, Barbara, come on in. Now, I'm really bad about this, and I promised myself I wasn't going to do this. There's two different ways to approach writing. I had a technical writing course in college, and there's this idea of a pyramid. So when you're writing, there's always the pyramid that you need to keep in mind. And it can be either a regular pyramid or it can be an inverted pyramid. The regular pyramid style of writing is where you build up to the point that you're trying to make. So you kind of chip away at the edges, you give all of your evidence, and then you lay out your case. And I kind of call that the murder mystery sort of a way of doing things. You present all this evidence, and then you finally, who done it? What's the ultimate, the spoiler on the last or second to last page, right? And that's a good way to write a murder mystery, but in my opinion, I think generally always the best way to go whenever you're trying to convey information is the inverted pyramid style, which is you tell people what your point is that you're trying to make. Just go ahead and lay out your main point, and then you work your way from there to all of the minor details. So you lay the foundation after you've spilled the beans or told everybody what the main point was. So I'm very bad about not doing that, about getting to the point, so to speak. So let me take a moment and I will read you a couple of things from chapter 3. So I'm going to skip past chapter 2 for right now. And I want to talk about a couple of quotes that maybe give you an idea of why I decided to talk about this book and incorporate it today. So, he says, all possible knowledge then depends on the validity of reasoning. If the feeling of certainty which we express by words like must be and therefore and since is a real perception of how things outside our minds really must be, well and good. But if this perception of how things outside our own minds really, but if this certainty is merely a feeling in our own minds, so in other words, if what we think, he kind of lays the groundwork, he says, all we have is the ability to infer things from nature. We have eyeballs, but the things we're seeing come through our eyes and they're processed in our brain. So we're kind of removed from reality in a certain sense anyway. And we can see the stars through telescopes, but we can't touch them. We're not there close to them in proximity. So most of, if not all of everything that we do to come to conclusions about things are done through inference. And so he says that if we use words like must, since, and therefore, if that really represents reality, the things that we're saying must be true, this is true, that's true, then that's great. But if this certainty is merely a feeling in our own minds and not a genuine insight into realities beyond them, if it merely represents the way our minds happen to work, then we can have no knowledge. Unless human reasoning is valid, no science can be true. Does that make sense to you? If the things that I'm thinking in my mind, if I think that I'm standing in this room right now, but I'm really asleep in my bed, we might all wish that. after I'm done. But if I'm not really here, then the things that I'm saying really don't make a difference. They don't really even make a difference to me. It doesn't matter, what I'm doing. But if I am standing here and I'm imparting to you some knowledge about God, about how to think about God, then that is important, because that is the ultimate goal, is to go to heaven. And so we have to understand, what do we have to do? Why do we have to do it? Why do we believe what we believe? And these are things that all hinge upon our ability to reason, right? So unless human reasoning is valid, no science can be true. He says, it follows that no account of the universe can be true unless that account leaves it possible for our thinking to be a real insight. A theory which explained everything else in the whole universe but made it impossible to believe that our thinking was valid would be utterly out of court, as he says. For that theory would itself have been reached by thinking. And if thinking is not valid, that theory would, of course, be itself demolished. It would have destroyed its own credentials. It would be an argument which proved that no argument was sound, a proof that there are no such things as proofs, which is nonsense. Thus, a strict materialism refutes itself for the reason given long ago by Professor Haldane. He quotes him, quote, if my mental processes are determined wholly by the motions of atoms in my brain, I have no reason to suppose that my beliefs are true, and hence I have no reason for supposing my brain to be composed of atoms. Do you understand the logic there, the reasoning? If my thoughts are just the product of the random, even if the atoms in my brain, if the motions of the atoms in my brains follow, rules of nature, it still doesn't mean that they're true. The things that I'm thinking, if it's just a culmination of, evolution and these movements of atoms, there's nothing that grounds my thoughts to the truth, if that's true. But naturalism, even if it is not purely materialistic, seems to me to involve the same difficulty, though in a somewhat less obvious form. It discredits our process of reasoning, or at least reduces their credit to such a humble level that it can no longer support naturalism itself. The easiest way of exhibiting this is to notice the two senses of the word because. We can say, grandfather is ill today because he ate lobster yesterday. We can also say, grandfather must be ill today because he hasn't gotten up yet, and we know he's an invariably early riser when he is well. In the first sentence, because indicates the relation of cause and effect. The eating made him ill. In the second, it indicates the relation of what logicians call ground and consequent. Now, those terms may have changed. They may use something different now, but he says that there is this ground and consequent terms. The old man's late rising is not the cause of his disorder, but the reason why we believe him to be disordered. There is a similar difference between he cried out because it hurt him, cause and effect, and it must have hurt him because he cried out. That's ground and consequent. We're especially familiar with the ground and consequent because in mathematical reasoning, A equals C because, as we have already proved, they are both equal to B. The one indicates a dynamic connection between events or states of affairs, the other a logical relation between beliefs or assertions. So again, I think those are pretty important things for us to be thinking about. And again, we'll talk more about how that. I don't want to give the whole lesson away. There are limitations to that inverse pyramid approach. I don't want to preach the sermon before I preach the sermon, but basically the idea is that we have to trust that our thinking is true, the things that we think are true. And if the things that we think aren't the result of reason and rational thoughts, if these are just the mindless, cause and effect, random motion of atoms in our brain, realistically, that kind of happens when we're asleep, right? I mean, when you're having a dream, you're thinking about things that aren't necessarily real. I mean, sometimes you're thinking about things that have happened or things that could happen, but these things don't actually exist. But we know that from our experience. We wake up and we remember, oh yeah, that was just a dream. That those things didn't actually happen. You ever had a dream where somebody did something to make you mad, and then you actually were mad at them in real life, and you really have no reason to be because they didn't do the thing that they did in your dream? But I don't know. I've had dreams kind of like that before, and of course they're irrational, and we have to realize that. But why are they irrational? Because we know that there's a difference between something that's true and something that is imagined, something that is not true. We observe nature, and we see that there are laws that govern nature, and so we realize again that there's a difference between things that we just imagine in our head. In fact, there are diseases. I think what is the disorder where you hear voices and they're not there, but you think they're there? Yeah, schizophrenia. So that's sort of a disorder. It's very difficult. So we have to be able to trust nature. We have to be able to trust the truth. And he makes the point that with the naturalist, they can never point to you any sort of ground truth. I mean, even your very existence, how do you prove that? It's the row, row, row your boat, right? Life is but a dream. How do you prove these things? If you're a naturalist, there's nothing that exists outside of nature. And you can't prove anything really beyond your own self. I mean, how do you know that anything existed yesterday? How do you know that anything has ever existed before? You could just, I always use that Twilight Zone episode example of the girl that, she had all this history in her head. Turned out she was a robot, and those memories had just been put into her head. It's kind of the naturalistic view of things. We're all automatons, and we're just the result of these random atoms in motion. So, again, that is the problem that the naturalist would have. Now, let me give you some additional information. Let's go back to chapter 2, now that we've kind of established some of these bigger points that I want to make. For the naturalist, of course, and this is chapter 2, he says, everything that exists is part of nature, which is a closed, interlocked system of cause and effect. The supernaturalist says that there is a foundational reality beyond nature that God created and sustains, which makes miracles possible. He defines nature as that which occurs of itself or of its own accord. That includes everything we observe through our senses or deduce through natural laws. The natural state is what happens when external forces are not intervening. And of course, the supernatural is a reality beyond the natural system, which includes the idea of a self-existing being, God, who sustains nature but is not bound by it. So for the naturalist, everything is part of an interdependent system of cause and effect. All events, a thought or an action, can be explained by prior physical or natural causes. And this is what a lot of people, futurists, like to speculate about this kind of stuff. They say, if we could make a computer big enough to contain the entire universe, which of course the universe wouldn't be able to contain that because it would contain our simulation plus everything else. But that notwithstanding, if we could make a supercomputer that could know the current state of atoms, the current state of the smallest parts of matter right now at this moment, plus their acceleration, their velocity, then you could take that and you could move forward in the future in your simulation, and you could predict things that happen hundreds of years from now, because there's no other way that the future could progress other than in this predetermined path. Does that make sense? So you have a starting point, and there is nothing that is going to prevent this point B in the future from happening. There's nothing that you can do between the two, because everything, right down to the thoughts in your head, are predetermined. This kind of dovetails with Calvinism, right? Doesn't it seem like it a little bit? So we have this concept in the naturalist world, and they will tell you, there are plenty of people, very smart, at least they think they are, that will tell you that everything we do is not of free will. We do not have free will in any meaningful way. We cannot change anything. Everything we do, even the things that we thought that we were going to do to defy that predetermined path, was already predetermined. The fact that I could, step over here and start singing at the top of my lungs at a moment's notice, I won't do that. But it's not because I'm predetermined. Well, I guess according to them, it would be. If I were to do something crazy, it would be because I've been pre-programmed to do that through this natural motions of atoms. And it only appears like we have free will because there's so many variables. There are just an infinite number of variables that go into the end result of every thought. But they're all predetermined. They're all mechanistic. There's nothing that transcends the physicalness of this world. And I have a problem with that. I'm sure that we all have a problem with that reasoning here, because it's really not reasoning. And you see, that kind of goes back to Lewis's original point, or a point a few minutes ago, where he says that if everything's mechanistic, then there is no reasoning. There's no such thing as reasoning. We just think that there's such a thing as reasoning. So that's the problem that they have. He uses a couple of analogies. He talks about naturalism's democracy. Everything exists within a single interdependent framework, like citizens in a democracy. All things are equally dependent on the system. Whereas supernaturalism is more like a monarchy, and we view it like that, don't we? So who's the king in this monarchy? I'll get some audience participation, maybe that'll. God, right? God is the monarch here, the Godhead. So reality is ruled by one self-existent being, akin to a king ruling a nation. So that's the two different ideas. I wonder if Lewis liked the idea of the British monarchy. I don't know that. I wonder if he's kind of got a little axe to grind there, since he's comparing the idea of a monarchy with God. But I pulled out some key quotes here from chapter 2, and if you would like to comment, please do so. He says, I use the word miracle to mean an interference with nature by supernatural power. So the significance of this is that he defines the central term of this book and sets the stage for the discussion. By framing miracles as interventions, he underscores that they require something beyond nature's closed system. Again, this whole book, the thrust of it is not the points I'm taking out. These are just incidental, although they are very central to these premises. I think he is trying to justify the idea of miracles existing in the context specifically of the Bible, like you're turning water into wine, these miracles that Jesus performed. He says, another quote, unless there exists in addition to nature something else which we may call the supernatural, there can be no miracles. So that has to be there, the supernatural, for there to even be miracles. Without a supernatural realm, miracles are logically impossible. Another quote, the naturalist believes that the ultimate fact, the thing you can't go behind, is a vast process in space and time which is going on of its own accord. And I'll say this again, I've said it many times before. I think it takes just as much, if not more, faith to believe that the universe just exists and has always existed and it sprang into existence from nothing, than to believe that the universe is a result of the actions of God, who has always existed. Is there really a functional difference in those two concepts? I mean, they both require faith to believe them. We can't measure, the universe springing into existence. So there's no scientific way to determine that. You have to take all the facts and process them and come to a conclusion. The universe exists. It's a function of either nothingness as the thing that created it, or an eternal God which created it. That seems more rational to me. But again, only if rationality exists in reality, only if reason is actually true. He says, the supernaturalist agrees with the naturalist that there must be something which exists in its own right, some basic fact whose existence it would be nonsensical to try to explain. But he does not identify this fact with the whole show. So the significance of this is the difference between the two views. While both believe in a basic fact, the supernaturalist sees it as a being, God, who created and sustains nature, rather than nature itself. So nature brought itself into existence, is the naturalist. Well, it is kind of a supernaturalist. It's beyond nature to me that nature brought itself into existence. Again, the bootstrap idea. Let's see. What are a couple of other quotes, and then we'll call it quits for this session. Let me skip to chapter 3 because we are kind of running out of time. And this is where really the core of what we're going to talk about today comes from. So the main idea of chapter 3 is that he argues naturalism is self-refuting because it undermines the validity of reason. If all human thought is purely the product of non-rational causes, then the reliability of human reasoning, including the reasoning behind naturalism itself, can't be trusted. So naturalism claim every finite thing or event can be fully explained within the closed system of nature, right? That's their claim. Human reasoning, like all other events, is merely the result of physical processes in the brain caused by prior events, cause and effect. And cause-effect relationships govern all phenomena, including thought. So that's the naturalist view of things. Reason requires ground-consequence relationships. A physical process where one event triggers another, like eating something, causes indigestion. So that's the cause and effect. The ground consequence is a logical relationship where a conclusion follows from a premise, like A equals B, B equals C, therefore A equals C. So that's the ground consequence relationship. Reasoning relies on the latter. A conclusion must be valid because it follows logically, not merely because it was caused by something else. And that's the kind of thing that you think about in the animal kingdom. An animal will fight or it will flee based on what's happening to it at the moment, right? It doesn't reason. There's no reasoning involved. It's always just a reaction. So that separates us from, now of course, there's some learned behaviors. Of course, you can train an animal to do certain things, but they're never going to reason on a high level like a human being does. So here's the conflict. If all human thought is simply the result of non-rational physical causes, cause and effect, it can't simultaneously function as a valid reasoning ground consequence. If all human thought is the result of non-rational physical causes, the motion of atoms, it can't at the same time function as valid reasoning, that is ground consequence. So again, we get into this circular reasoning, so to speak, or this bootstrap approach. Naturalism reduces reasoning to a byproduct of brain chemistry or evolutionary processes. And if that's true, there's no reason to trust that reasoning itself leads to truth. So the very reasoning they say, oh, I know the truth because I can reason. I see all this evidence around me of the physical world, and therefore I come to the conclusion there is no God. That there is no reasoning that you can justify, that you can't prove that, because when you say that everything is a result of naturalism, everything is the result of atoms in motion, then even the very conclusion that you came to, saying there is no God, cannot be trusted. There is no truth that you can come to. Does that make sense? There's just no way to prove. There's nothing to anchor the truth for that line of reasoning. So naturalism has a self-contradiction. It claims that reason evolved through natural selection as a survival mechanism, but survival-focused behavior doesn't require truth, only utility. Again, going back to the animal idea, animals understand the concept of they don't understand concepts per se. They just know that they're experiencing pain right now, they're experiencing pleasure, and they're driven by those. That's why we call them, animal urges or animal instincts, right? There's not a level above that includes rational reasoning. Naturalism provides no guarantee that human reasoning aims at truth, only that it is useful for survival. He points out this paradox. Naturalism relies on reasoning to argue that naturalism is true. If naturalism is correct, reasoning is just a series of non-rational events, and there's no reason to trust its conclusion, including the conclusion that naturalism is true. So it creates a self-refuting loop. Naturalism discredits the very reasoning it uses to argue for itself. And again, I go back to this quote from Professor Haldane that he uses. If my mental processes are determined wholly by the motions of atoms in my brain, I have no reason to suppose that my beliefs are true. If thoughts are solely determined by physical processes, they are not grounded in truth, but in necessity. Well, we'll get into some of these a little bit more, but hopefully I've conveyed, and I'm sorry if it was a little scattered, the principles that we're trying to establish here for the ideas of reasoning and truth, and where truth comes from and where it can't possibly come from.